Hi, I'm Frances and welcome to my channel. Today I wanted to read J.D. Salinger's novella, The Inverted Forest. This one is a very long one. Well, long for a short story the size of a novella. But I doubt that I can do this in one sitting. So I'm going to probably have two parts, part one and part two. But I won't put them on my page until I have the whole thing complete so that you can go from the first video to the second if you want to hear the story. I also want to say that there is some German in the beginning of this, and I'm sure it's not a lot. It's just a tiny little bit, but I'm sure that I'm going to butcher it because I don't know German at all. But I'm going to do my best to read that little part, and my apologies if it is a mess. So I'm going to read this. This was written by J.D. Salinger, and it was published in Cosmopolitan magazine in December of 1947. This is my personal favorite. I love this story so much, and I am going to try and do my best to do the best reading I can, just because I love this short story, and I hope that I do an okay job. Okay, so here we go. The Inverted Forest by J.D. Salinger. To say that this short novel is unusual magazine fare is, we think, a wild understatement. We're not going to tell you what it's about. We merely predict you will find it the most original story you've read in a long time and the most fascinating. The following diary extract is dated December 31st, 1917. It was written in Shoreview, Long Island by a little girl named Corinne von Nordhoffen. She was the daughter of Sarah Keyes Montrose von Nordhoffen, the Montrose orthopedic appliance heiress who had committed suicide in 1915, and Baron Otho von Nordhoffen, who was still alive, or at least under his gray mask of expatriation, was still breathing. Corinne entered this chapter in her diary on the night before her 11th birthday. Tomorrow is my birthday, and I'm going to have a party. I have invited Raymond Ford and Miss Egeltinger and Lorraine Peterson and Dorothy Wood and Marjorie Phelps and Lawrence Phelps and Mr. Miller. Miss Egeltinger said I had to invite Lawrence Phelps on account of Marjorie is coming. I have to invite Mr. Miller on account of he works for Father now. Father said Mr. Miller will drive to New York in the morning and bring back 2 cowboy movies and show them in the library after dinner. I got Raymond a real cowboy hat to wear, just like the cowboy he likes wears. I got everybody else hats also, only paper ones. Miss Egeltinger is going to give me Parade Prejudice by Jane Austen, she said. She is also going to give me the Elsie I don't have. She is the most adorable teacher I have had since Miss Callahan. Father is also going to give me more room in the kennels for Sandy's puppies, and I already saw the dollhouse from Wanamaker's. Dorothy Wood is going to give me an autograph album and gave it to me already 3 weeks ago. She wrote in the front of it, "In your golden chain of friendship, consider me a link." I nearly cried. Dorothy is so adorable. I don't know what Lorraine and Marjorie are going to give me. I wish that mean Lawrence Phelps did not have to come to my party. I don't want Raymond Ford to give me anything for my birthday, just so he comes is all. He is so poor and not rich at all, and you can tell by his clothes. He actually writes cloths. I wish Dorothy had not written on the first page of the album because I wanted Raymond. Mr. Miller is going to give me an alligator. He has this brother in Florida that has alligators and TB like Miss Callahan had. I love Raymond Ford. I love him better than my father. Anybody that opens this diary and reads this page will drop dead in 24 hours, tomorrow night. Please, dear Lord, don't let Lawrence Phelps be mean at my party, and don't let Father and Mr. Miller talk German at the table or anything, because I just know they would all go home and tell their parents about it, except Raymond and Dorothy. I love you, Raymond, because you are the nicest boy in the world, and I'm going to marry you. Anybody that reads this without my permission will drop dead in 24 hours or get sick. Close to 9 o'clock on the night of Corinne's birthday party, Mr. Miller, the Baron's new secretary, leaned forward and volunteered down table straight at Corinne. "Well, let's go get this boy. No use sitting around moping about it all night. Where does he live, birthday girl?" Corinne, at the end of the table, shook her head and blinked violently. Under the table, her hands were caught hard between her knees. He lives right on Winona, spoke up Marjorie. His mother's a waiter at the Lobster Palace. They live over the restaurant. She looked around, pleased. Waitress, corrected her brother Lawrence with contempt. Little Dorothy Wood, seated at Corinne's right, shot one of her high-strung glances up table towards the Baron. But the old gentleman was busy examining, somewhat morosely, the cuff of his dinner jacket. He had just brushed his sleeve into his ice cream, the sort of thing that often happened to him. Dorothy's high-strung glances in his direction were unnecessary anyway. The Baron's hearing device was seldom aimed at table talk, birthday parties not accepted, and regularly all evening he had been missing Lawrence Phelps' smart boy alto. Well, waitress, conceded Marjorie Phelps. Anyway, he lives where I said, because Hermione Jackson's cousin followed him home once. Winona Avenue. Mr. Miller stood up confidently. He dropped his napkin on the table and removed his pale green, unfestive-looking paper hat. He was a bald-headed man with a jolly, humorless face. Let's go, birthday kiddo, he said. Again, the hostess shook her head and blinked wildly this time. Miss Egletinger leaned forward. A committee of one for smooth-running birthday parties. Corinne, dear, go with Mr. Mueller. Why don't you, honey? Miller, corrected Miller. Miller, excuse me. Go with Mr. Miller, dear. Why don't you? It'll only take a teensy minute, and we'll all be right here when you get back. Miss Egletinger turned rather coyly to the Baron on whose left she was sitting. Won't we, Baron? She asked. He isn't a Baron anymore. He's an American citizen. Corinne said so, Dorothy Wood stated firmly, and immediately blushed. What is it, please? Inquired the Baron, aiming his hearing apparatus at Miss Egletinger. To the never-stale interest of all the children present, except Corinne, Miss Egletinger picked up the Baron's speaking tube and shouted thinly into it. I say we'll all be right here when they get back, won't we? They're going into town to look for the Ford boy. She started to relinquish the tube, but instead took a firmer hold on it. Very strange child. Came to us in October, she shouted elaborately. Not a good mixer. Though he hadn't understood a word, the Baron nodded pleasantly. Dispirited, Miss Egletinger placed a protective hand to her throat where all the volume had passed through, and willingly gave over to Mr. Miller, who was standing ready beside her chair. Miller picked up the tube and shouted into it, We're worden sofort zurk. Kindly speak English, interrupted the Baron. Miller flushed slightly, but shouted, We'll be right back. We're going to look for the youngster who didn't come to the party. The Baron understood Miller and nodded. Then he glared down table at Dorothy Wood, a favorite of his, whom he regularly frightened to death. You didn't eat anything, he accused her. Eat. Dorothy was too rattled to do anything but blush. She doesn't eat anything, the Baron complained, to no one in particular. Get your coat, birthday girl, Miller said to Corinne, standing directly over her. No, said Corinne, please. Corinne, dear, intervened Miss Egletinger, it's just possible that Raymond Ford forgot your party. Those things happen in the best of families. There's no harm, surely, if you just I reminded him this morning. I told him at recess. It was the longest remark Corinne had made all evening. Yes, dear, but he may not be well. He may be ill. He might just be in bed. You could take him a lovely piece of birthday cake, couldn't she, Mr. Miller? Sure. Miller placed a hand on the back of Miss Egletinger's chair. Must be quite a youngster, he mused, sucking his tooth. What is he, the Frank Merriwell of his class or something? The who? Coolly inquired Miss Egletinger, addressing the hand on the back of her chair. The school athlete. You know, all the girls after him. The demon on the cinder path. Him an athlete? Interrupted Lawrence Phelps. He can't even catch a football. You know what? Robert Selridge saw Ford coming across the playground and yelled at him and chucked a football at him. Not even fast. And you know what Ford did? Mr. Miller, inserting the nail of his little finger between two molars, shook his head. He jumped out of the way. Honest. He wouldn't even chase it afterwards. Boy, Robert Selridge nearly socked him one. Lawrence Phelps turned his burly little face towards his hostess. Where'd Ford come from anyways, Corinne? He didn't come from round here anywheres. Corinne replied inaudibly. What? said Lawrence. She said, none of your beeswax, Dorothy Wood translated loyally. Corinne, rebuked Mr. Miller, removing his finger from his mouth. Is that nice? Tell him about his back, Marjorie Phelps suggested to her brother. She turned brightly to the others, informing them. Lawrence saw his back at doctor's hour. It's all things all over it. Big awful marks like. Oh, that, yeah, said her brother. His mother heats him up. The hostess stood up. You're a liar, she accused, trembling. He hurt himself. He fell and hurt himself. Children, children, this from Miss Egletinger with a nervous glance at the Baron, who, undisturbed, went on staring profoundly at an embroidered pattern in the tablecloth. All right, he fell and hurt himself, Lawrence Phelps said. Corinne sat down, trembling. Lawrence, I don't ever want to hear you say anything like that again, Miss Egletinger said. It does not happen to be true in the first place. The school board investigates those things, all those things. If that boy's mother... Oh, I know why she likes Ford, Lawrence interrupted ambiguously. I don't want to tell, though. He glanced over at his hostess's suddenly up-jerked, burning little face. Then, efficiently, as though he were dealing with butterfly wings, he tore his hostess's horror apart on the spot. Because Louise Selfridge was sore, Corinne won the elocution, and right in front of everybody in the wardrobe closet, Louise called Corinne a Heine spy. And Louise said, even her father said, why don't Corinne and her father go to Germany, where all the Heines are, the Kaiser and all? And Corinne started to cry. And Raymond Ford was wardrobe monitor that day, and he chucked Louise Selfridge's coat out in the aisle. Lawrence said, taking a breath but not quite finished, and last week Corinne brought her dog after school to show Ford, and she wrote his name on the blackboard at recess and tried to erase it, but everybody saw it. No more butterfly wings on hand. Lawrence looked vaguely in the direction of the footman behind him. Can I please have another spoon? Mine fell. Lawrence, we don't repeat those things. Honest, said Lawrence, as though his integrity were in jeopardy. You can ask my sister. Ask anybody. Ford was giving Louise Selfridge her coat when she said it, only he didn't give it to her. He chucked it right out in the aisle. Everybody... What time is it, Miller? The Baron asked suddenly. Everyone in the room became still. Miller pushed back the sleeve of his coat. 9:20, Baron. Miller turned to Corinne. What is it? What's it going to be, kiddo? You want to go look for this boy or not? Yes, said Corinne, and walked with adult dignity out of the dining room. The dark road was icy, and there were no skid chains on Mr. Miller's automobile. He didn't believe in them. Yours will be here tomorrow, he promised Corinne in the unfraternal darkness. He was speaking incessantly of his brother's alligators. Little bit of a fella, but he'll grow. He'll grow all right. He chuckled, tobacco breathily, toward Corinne. Please don't go so fast. What's that? Somebody scared? It's this street, Corinne said excitedly. Right here, please. Where? Said Miller. You passed it. Well, we can fix that, said Miller. The car skidded, selected its own direction, and came to a stop with its four wheels up on the sidewalk. Corinne, shivering, let herself out of the car and ran the slippery quarter of a block to the place where the Lobster Palace should have been shining yellowy. But something was wrong. The Lobster Palace wasn't shining at all. Both the front show window and the electric sign were as black as the night itself. Closed, eh? Miller said, reaching Corinne. His breath in the sub-zero air was almost more visible than he was. The house can't be closed. The restaurant may be, but the house can't be. People live upstairs. Raymond Ford lives upstairs. Instantly, as though in proof of part of Corinne's remark, a woman carrying 2 suitcases charged out of the black doorway, brushing past Corinne. No kind of hall light preceded or followed her. She snorted visibly over to the curb, dropped her 2 suitcases on the icy walk, and faced the doorway from which she had emerged. Then, just as Corinne felt Mr. Miller pull her neutrally out of the way, another figure, that of a small boy, came out of the building. Corinne excitedly called his name, but the boy didn't seem to hear her. He went directly to the woman with the suitcases, stood beside her, and faced as she was facing. He took something out of his pocket, unfolded it, put it on his head, and pulled it down over his ears. Corinne knew it was his aviator's cap. Listen, said the lady with Raymond Ford harshly, I'm entitled to my galoshes. Corinne saw with a start that the lady was not addressing Raymond Ford, but something in the doorway, a glowing cigar. I told ya, said the cigar, the restaurant's locked, and it's going to stay locked the whole time the boss is at his brother's funeral. Listen, you had all afternoon to pick up your galoshes. Yeah, said the lady with Raymond Ford. Yeah, said the cigar, and got even redder. You ain't supposed to leave no galoshes in no kitchen, you know that. Listen, said the lady with Raymond Ford, I'm going to stop at the damn police station on my way to the station, hear me? A person's entitled to the property. Let's go, please, said Raymond Ford, taking the lady's arm. Please, he's not going to give you the galoshes, can't you see? Let go, you. Don't rush me, the lady said. I'm not leaving the vicinity without them galoshes. Something like laughter came from the doorway. If your feet get cold, break open one of them bags of yours, suggested the cigar. You got plenty to keep you warm. Mother, come on, please, Raymond Ford said. Can't you see he's not going to give them to you? I want them galoshes. A door banged. Frightened, Corinne looked and saw that the cigar was gone. Raymond Ford's mother ran a few wild steps on the ice, stopped perilously short, recovered her balance, and began to pound with her fist against the dark show window of the restaurant, at the place where normally the lobsters could be seen winking on cracked ice. She screamed as she pounded, articulating words that Corinne had nervously read from walls and fences. Corinne felt Mr. Miller's grip tighten on her arm, but Corinne stayed where she was because Raymond Ford was now standing before her. He spoke to Corinne just loud enough to be heard over his mother's activities directly behind him. I'm sorry I couldn't come to your party. That's all right. How's your dog? Said Raymond Ford. He's fine. That's good, said Raymond Ford, and went over to his mother and began to pull her by the arm. But she wrenched successfully away from him, scarcely losing the rhythm of her violence. Mr. Miller came forward, cupping his cold ears with his hands. I'd be glad to drive you people to the station if that's where you're going, he shouted. Raymond Ford's mother stopped pounding and shouting. She turned away from the show window, glanced briefly at Miller in the darkness, then at Corinne, then back at Miller. Raymond Ford indicated Corinne with his thumb. She's a friend of mine, he said. You got a car? Mrs. Ford asked Miller. How can I take you to the police station if I didn't? Where is it? Miller pointed. Right there. Mrs. Ford nodded absently. She then turned around and, using an Anglo-Saxon verb, gave the dark show window a short, obscene command. She turned back to Miller. Let's get out of here before I get mad, she told him. She sat beside Miller in the front seat, and the two children sat in the back with the suitcases. The car moved off on a slippery tangent, straightened out, and went on. He wasn't the guy that engaged me for the position, Mrs. Ford announced suddenly. The guy that engaged me was a gentleman. She was addressing Miller's profile. Hey, haven't I seen you in the restaurant? I don't believe so, Miller said stiffly. Live in this lousy borough? No, I do not. Just work here, eh? Mother, don't ask the man so many questions. Why do you want to ask the man so many questions? She turned savagely around in her seat. Listen, you. Stay out of the discussion, she ordered. When I'm interested in your 2 cents, I'll let you. I'm Baron von Nordhofen's secretary, Miller said quickly to keep the peace in his automobile. Yeah, the hiney on the hill? She sounded suspicious. How come you're riding around in this tin, Lizzie? Where's all the limousines? This happens to be my own car, Miller said coldly. That's different, I wondered. Mrs. Ford seemed to reflect for a moment, then sharply and hostilely spoke to Miller's profile. Don't you high-hat me, Charlie. I don't feel like being high-hatted the mood I'm in. Miller, a little frightened, cleared his throat. I can assure you, he said, nobody's high-hatting anybody. Mrs. Ford abruptly lowered her window, removed something from her mouth, and flicked it into the night. Closing the window, she said, I come from a damn good family. I had everything. Money, social position, class. She looked at Miller. You happen to have any cigarettes on you by chance? I'm afraid not, she shrugged. Listen, I could go home right now and say to Dad, Dad, I'm tired of being an adventuress. I want to settle down and take it easy for a while. He'd be tickled to death. I'd make him the happiest dad in the world. Raymond Ford's mother was silent for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice sounded more glum than inflamed. My trouble is I married beneath me. I married a chap that was way beneath me was my trouble. Every way you look at it. Miller's curiosity got the better of him. Your husband dead? He asked coldly. I was just a beautiful, dumb kid, Raymond Ford's mother mused with affection. Miller repeated his question. I don't know what the hell he is, dead or what, she said. Then abruptly she sat up straight in her seat and began to clear away frost from her window using the heel of her hand. We're here, she announced dispassionately, and turned in her seat to address her son. "Now listen," she said to him. "I mean what I told you. You let that bag flap open like last time and I'll break your back." "The straps broke," Raymond Ford said. "You heard me. I'll break your back," said his mother, working the handle of the door. She turned to Miller, saying, "Thanks for the ride, Snob," and got out of the car. Without another glance toward the car or her son or her luggage, she began to walk toward the glowing station waiting room. Raymond Ford opened his door and got out. He then lifted out the 2 suitcases one at a time. Corinne let down her window. "You want me to tell Miss Egeltinger you won't be in school tomorrow?" "You can if you want to, I guess." "Where are you going?" "I don't know," Raymond Ford said. "Goodbye." He picked up the 2 suitcases and began to walk after his mother, who had already disappeared. The suitcases were huge and looked dead weight. Corinne saw him fall once on the hard snow. Then he disappeared. Corinne's father died, with equal parts of courage and an alien's confusion when she was 16. When she was 17, the Shoreview estate was sold, and Eric, the chauffeur, performed his last duty for the von Nordhoffen menage by driving Corinne to Wellesley. At 17, Corinne was nearly 6 feet tall with low heels. She walked rather like an umpire measuring out yards on a football field. You had to get right up close to her to see that she was a beauty. Actually, her long legs were very interesting looking, but not only her legs, all of her. Although her fair hair was just a little anemic, it would later call for tact on the part of her hairdresser. If Madame's suggestions were a little too fashionable, it didn't really matter. It was the kind of hair that lets the ears be visible now and then, and Corinne's ears happened to be extraordinary, delicate, almost sweet in formation and position, with blade-thin edges. Her nose was long, but very slender and very high-bridged. It looked lovely, even on the coldest day. Her eyes were hazel, and though not enormous, enormously kind. When her lips were ajar, which was seldom, as her face was nearly always caught tight in some private insecurity, but when they were ajar, you saw that they were not thin at all. You saw that the middle of her lower lip was full and round. She was a wonderful-looking girl. When she was 17, though, most boys she knew found her anything but wonderful. For one reason, her speech was rapid and uncloying to the point of being brusque, and to go with it, unfortunately, her conversation stuck very close to the facts. While some boy, for example, was giving her the exact figures on the number of highballs he had consumed just the other night, Corinne was entirely apt to break in with some terrible remark like, "If we hurry, we can catch the 12:31 instead of the 12:40. Do you feel like running?" There was something else. Young men sensed, or actually found out, that Corinne did not like to be touched unnecessarily. When she was, she either jumped or apologized. It was the sort of thing that can play hell with a man going to Yale next year Saturday night. So Corinne went right on jumping or apologizing for a long time. Perhaps none of her young men could have helped her anyway. It takes a certain amount of genius to touch anybody properly, let alone a mixed-up girl. In college, Corinne came out of herself a little bit. Not much, but a little bit. The girls discovered behind her diffidence a sense of humor, and they made her use it, but that wasn't all. It gradually leaked out all over the dormitory that Corinne could keep a secret, and very early in her freshman year, she was unofficially elected dormitory kid. On many a cold Massachusetts night, consequently, she was obliged to get out of a warm bed to put out somebody else's cat of guilt or innocence. To some extent, the functions of her office were good for her own well-being. Giving out midnight advice can be highly instructive after it comes poisonously home a few times, but if you're kept at the job too long, straight through your senior year, say, all the knowledge you pick up finally turns academic and useless. After graduating from Wellesley, she went to Europe. She preferred doing that to going straight to Philadelphia to live with her maternal second cousin. Besides, she had an old, undisciplined urge to visit her dead father's estate in Germany. She had a feeling that on arriving there, she would respond more poignantly to the memory of things long over and ungracefully done with. Although nothing daughter size turned up for her when she did finally see her father's estate, she stayed on in Europe for 3 years. She studied and played, more or less after a fashion, in Paris, in Vienna, Rome, Berlin, St. Anton, Cannes, Lausanne. She prescribed for herself some of the usual American and Europe neurotic fun, plus some accessible exclusively to girls who happen to be millionairesses. Over a period of 30-odd months, she bought herself 9 cars. Not all of them bored her. Some she gave away. Nobody, of course, can make the American rich feel quite as filthy as can a poor but clean European. Corinne knew a great number of men and boys during her 3 years in Europe, but her only real friend was a young man from Detroit. His name was Pat, but I don't know whether it stood for Patrick or Patterson. Anyway, he was very probably the first young man who had ever successfully ordered Corinne to close her eyes while she was being kissed. He most certainly was the first person whom Corinne had ever allowed to pass vicariously along the streets of her childhood to see a small boy in a woolen aviator's cap. The young man from Detroit was no fool. When he found out just how regularly Corinne was making private trips back to her childhood, he tried to do something about it. With the best intentions, he tried to set up some kind of detour in Corinne's mind, but he never really got a chance. He fell off the running board of Corinne's 9th car in his swimming trunks and was killed. Corinne went back to America after his death. She went to Philadelphia, to her cousin's house, where she had spent all her college vacations, but she stayed only a month. A girl from Wellesley told her over the telephone about a darling, overpriced apartment in the East 60s in New York. The girl said it was just perfect for Corinne. Corinne took the apartment in New York and sat in it for nearly 6 months. She read a great deal. The young man from Detroit had first approached her on a like the books I read basis, and she was now a heavy reader. She met a few ex-Wellesley girls for lunch or theater. She signed a few papers when her late father's lawyer asked her to. But she had been a New Yorker almost 7 months before anything significant happened to her. She was having a few dates with a brother of her last roommate in college. The young man was one of the most successful tomcats in town, and Corinne was young enough to inform him one evening that he had a simply terrible Oedipus complex. Displeased with the information, the young gentleman threw his highball at her, catching her in the right eye with a fresh ice cube. The shiner that developed started Corinne off as a career girl because when it disappeared, she felt she ought to do something constructive by way of celebration. So she telephoned Robert Weiner, had lunch with him, and asked him if he could get her a job on the news magazine he was working for. I think I'll say here, and then let it go, that I am Robert Weiner. I don't really have a good reason for taking myself out of the third person. Corinne had not seen Weiner in nearly 4 years. During her college years, she had seen more of him than any other boy. She had thought he was funny. When Weiner had finally found that out, of course, he had begun to get even funnier. He got so funny at senior prom at Wellesley that Corinne had broken into tears and asked him to please go back to his own college. Weiner, in love with Corinne, had left Wellesley immediately. He had written to her while she had been in Europe, sending her as many letters as he could salvage from his wastebasket. Weiner's boss at the magazine liked Corinne immediately and gave her a job pinning news items together for a rewrite man. Corinne did that for about a year. Then, when the rewrite man wrote a hot novel and went to Hollywood, she took over his job stringing adjectives. Tall, gaunt, left-handed Anthony Creep, accompanied by his wife, 93-year-old, web-footed, ex-manicurist, etc. Thereafter, Corinne's name began to move up the masthead quite steadily until, in another 4 years, it was on a line with only 4 other names, which meant roughly that less than 40 people on the magazine had a right to push her copy around. Her career was entirely remarkable. She had started out on it unable to understand just what she had to lose were she to fail as a career girl. In consequence, she was so cool about the whole setup that in an office full of tense, ambitious people, she was taken at face value for efficient. It wasn't hard for her later to live up to her own reputation. She happened to be a really good magazine woman. She was not only competent all-round reporter and editor, but she developed also into a good, if not brilliant, drama critic. As for Corinne's personal life during the first 5 years she worked for the magazine, I guess it could be recorded on a single sheet of any inter-office memo pad. Her wire-haired terrier, Malcolm, isn't properly housebroken and probably never will be. She is an easy, anonymous touch for any institution or individual, depending upon charity. She likes cherry stone clams and usually takes a double order. She does not lie. She is very likely to turn around in a taxi cab to watch a child cross the street. She will not discuss the idiosyncrasy. She regularly renews her subscription to Psychoanalytic Quarterly, a publication she barely glances through. She herself has never been psychoanalyzed. Her legs grow lovelier every year. Robert Wayner bought 2 things to give to Corinne on her 30th birthday. One of them, an engagement ring. Corinne retreated from, and Wayner, still the funny man, tried to drop it into the fare box of a Madison Avenue bus. The other gift, a book of poems called The Cowardly Morning, Wayner put on Corinne's desk at the office with a note saying, "This man is Coleridge and Blake and Rilke all in one, and more." Corinne took the book home with her in a taxi and tossed it on her bedspread. She didn't pick up the book again until she was in bed late that night. Then she glanced at the cover and opened the book with a dim impression that she was about to read some poems by someone who was not T.S. Eliot or Marion Moore, someone named Thane or Flood or Wilson. She raced through the first 2 poems in the book, both of which happened to be cerebral enough to require the reader's cooperation, and started emptily on the 3rd poem. But she suddenly felt sorry for the poet for having her as a reader, and she politely turned back to the 1st poem. She had once done the same thing to Marion Moore. The 1st poem was the title poem. This time Corinne read it through aloud, but still she didn't hear it. She read it through a 3rd time and heard some of it. She read it through a 4th time and heard all of it. It was the poem containing the lines, "Not wasteland, but a great inverted forest with all foliage underground." As though it might be best to look immediately for shelter, Corinne had to put the book down. At any moment, the apartment building seemed liable to lose its balance and topple across 5th Avenue into Central Park. She waited. Gradually, the deluge of truth and beauty abated. Then she glanced at the cover of the book. She began to stare at it. Then suddenly she got out of bed and dialed Robert Wayner's number on the telephone. "Bobby," she said. "Corinne." "It's all right. I wasn't asleep. It isn't even 4:00. "Bobby, who is this Rayford?" "Who?" "Rayford, the man who wrote the poems you gave me." "Ray, let me sleep over it a while. I'll see you at the office." "Bobby, please. I think I know him. I may know him. I knew someone named Raymond Ford, really." "Good, I'll wait for you at the office. Good night." "Bobby, wake up, please. This is terribly important. Don't you know anything about him?" "I only read the blurb on the back flap. That's all." Corinne hung up. In her excitement, she hadn't thought of looking at the back flap of the dust jacket. She rushed back to her bed and read the few notes on Rayford. She read that this Rayford was twice the winner of the Rice Fellowship for Poetry and 3 times the winner of the annual Strauss, and that he now divided his time between his creative work and his duties as an instructor at Columbia University in New York. He was born in Boise, Idaho, an upsetting fact, as it should have been a decisive one, but Corinne had no idea where her Rayford had been born. But the note said that he was 30 years old, which was exactly, electrically right. Corinne looked to see if there was a dedication. There was. The book was dedicated to the memory of a Mrs. Rizzio. This piece of information might have been a little puncturing, but Corinne's imagination was already off the ground. It was very simple. Mrs. Rizzio was Raymond Ford's mother, remarried. Crane didn't even bother to consider, much less get around, the unlikelihood of an author or anybody else referring to his mother in the third person. She didn't need logic. She needed more excitement. She jumped back into bed with her book. Sitting erectly in bed without lighting cigarettes, Corinne read The Cowardly Morning until the maid came in to wake her for breakfast. And even all the while she was getting dressed, she felt Ray Ford's poems standing upright all over her room. She even kept an eye on them in her dressing table mirror, lest they escape into their natural vertical ascent. And when she left for the office, she closed her door securely. From her office later that morning, she twice telephoned Columbia, but didn't get to speak to the author of The Cowardly Morning. He was either in class or not in the building just now. At noon, she quit work and went home and slept until 4 o'clock. Then she called the Columbia number again. This time she spoke to Ray Ford. Corinne began with a good, strong apology. "I hope I'm not taking you away from something," she said rapidly. "But my name is Corinne von Nordhoffen, and I used to know someone." "Who?" interrupted the voice on the other end. She said her name again. "Oh, how are you, Corinne?" Corinne said she was fine, and then supplied quite a gap in the conversation. She was much less taken aback by the fact that this was actually her Ray Ford than she was by the fact that her Ray Ford remembered her at all. After all, he was not salvaging her name out of an old cocktail party, but out of a childhood partitioned off by 19 years. She became very nervous. "I never expected you to remember me," she said. She began to think and talk in jumps. "I read your book of poems last night. I'd like to tell you how beautiful I thought they were." "I know that isn't the right word. I mean the right word." "It's very nice," said Ford evenly. "Thank you, Corinne." "I live in New York," Corinne said. "I was just wondering about that. You don't live in Bayonne anymore?" "Shoreview, Long Island," she quickly corrected. "Shoreview, of course. Don't you live there anymore?" "No, my father died and I sold the house," Corinne said, finding her own voice dissonant. How's your mother?" "She died a long time ago, Corinne." "I'm not keeping you from a class or something," Corinne demanded abruptly. No. Corinne stood up as though someone wanted her seat. "Well, I just wanted to tell you how much I love them, your poems. It's very nice of you, Corinne, really." She sat down again. She laughed. "It certainly is remarkable that you're the same Ray Ford, who wrote those poems. It isn't an extraordinary name." No, it isn't." Where did you go after you left Shoreview?" Without wanting a cigarette, she reached for a cigarette box. "I don't really remember, Corinne. It's such a long time ago." "It certainly is," she agreed and stood up. "I'm probably taking your time. I just wanted to tell you how—" "Will you have lunch with me one day next week, Corinne?" Ford asked. Corinne fumbled with a cigarette lighter. "I'd love to," she said. Ford said, "There's a little Chinese restaurant very near here. Do you like Chinese food?" "I love it." The lighter slipped out of her hand and fell on the telephone table. They arranged for lunch the following Tuesday at 1 o'clock. Then Corinne had a chance to run to her phonograph, flick it on, and turn the volume knob all the way to the right. She listened ecstatically as the music, the Maldo, flowed into the room very sensibly, drawing everything in sight. I'm going to stop here, and then I'm going to come back and pick up. And so there will be a part 2 of this, and I hope you enjoyed it. Okay? Thank you for watching. Goodbye.